Thank you so much. Well, first of all, thank you to everybody who found the time to attend this seminar. I'm also very excited to be here and to host our three renowned guests. My name is Piotr Plewa. I'm a visiting scholar at Duke Center for International and Global Studies. I also teach international migration at the Duke's Sanford School of Public Policy. Throughout my throughout over a decade of work on international migration, I realized that there's nothing more eye-opening than learning through fieldwork. And I think we are here for a treat today because we were able to invite to this webinar three speakers who have who are experts in human rights, who are experts in Mexico, and perhaps most importantly, who have had quite significant direct contact with migrants. So we can learn through this webinar about migration to Mexico through the perspective that is perhaps similar to what we would have heard from migrants themselves. So we'll have three excellent speakers. The first one is Maureen Meyer. Maureen comes from WOLA, Washington Office for Latin America. And she is a vice president for programs, as well as director for Mexico and migrant rights, with a special focus on analyzing US-Mexico security policies. She has recently analyzed Mexico immigration policies through a report that she co-authored, and it's called Wall Beyond the Wall. Even though the objective of this seminar would be to really focus on Mexico, to understand how Mexican immigration policies evolved and worked in practice, Maureen also brings a large expertise in migration from Mexico to the United States and basically on two sides of the border, which will be very useful in understanding how Mexican migration policies evolved. The second speaker we are lucky to have is Alejandra Macías Delgadillo. Alejandra is another expert in human rights. She has presented in front of many human rights bodies, among them the UN. And she will be here to give us good idea about how asylum system in Mexico works, as well as what are the trends. Finally, last but not least, we will hear from Ramon Marquez. Ramon Marquez has had extensive experience working with migrants. He himself is a migrant in Mexico, coming from Spain, but he will bring us a very unique and very needed perspective that he has gained while directing La 72, which is a migrant reception center in Tabasco in southeastern Mexico. Just a brief context, we are talking about Mexico as a country that has been recently receiving more and more migrants and asylum seekers. Of course, Mexico is still largely an immigration country with 12 million migrants leaving Mexico and only 1 million migrants coming to Mexico. We are still talking about Mexico as an immigration country. Also among the migrants in Mexico, 70% come from the United States. So today we will focus on a small subsection of migrants to Mexico, on those coming from Central America. And what is important to discuss here are not perhaps the quantitative issues, because there are relatively few migrants in Mexico, but about some of the qualitative issues that we can already observe on the ground. So without further ado, I would like you to join the three speakers for their very brief presentations. We will have 15 minutes for each speaker, and after which we'll have remaining 20 minutes for questions and answers. If you would like to submit a question, please use the question and answer button at the bottom of the screen. Giovanni and I will then try to select as many questions as possible, possibly linking them together to save time. And we will end the seminar at 15 past the hour. Well, thank you so much. Perhaps, Maureen, could you get us started? If you could just tell us, how has Mexican immigration policies evolved, and what are their strengths, what are their weaknesses, what has changed since COVID, what are the links between the northern and the southern frontier that you wrote about?
Oh, great, thank you. Thanks for the introduction. Thanks to the Center for International Development and the Center for International Global Studies at Duke for hosting this great conversation. I'm very happy to be sharing it with some very well-esteemed colleagues from Mexico. I thought I'd just give a quick overview of what has shifted in recent years in terms of Mexico's own immigration policy. And I think it's clear with the López Obrador administration that from when López Obrador took office in December 2018 to almost the middle of the next year, 2019, there was a pretty significant shift in policy. So López Obrador took office promising a new, more humane approach to migration of Central Americans and others coming through Mexico, either to settle in Mexico or to travel north to the United States. One of the actions was signing a memorandum with the three governments of the Northern Triangle, with Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, to look more at how can we work more on cooperation in addressing the root causes of migration. And that is something that he really did push and encouraged. He reached out to President Trump, the United States, to also encourage the US to look more at what he would view some of the development aspects that were driving migration flows from Central America. The first commissioner that he had named for the National Migration Institute, the INM in Mexico, Tonatiuh Guillén, came in having a trajectory of academic experience and research looking at immigration issues, and really talked about a reform agenda and modernization of both the Immigration Institute, but also looking at migration as an advantage for Mexico. And I think what really shifted from this very positive approach and welcome of migrants was the reality on the ground in terms of migration flows, but also particularly US pressure. One is that it's clear Central American migration in particular has increased significantly since probably 2013-14. I'm sure Ramon in particular could talk about the flow of people coming based on ongoing violence and persecution in particularly Northern Triangle countries of Central America, crippling poverty, and a real feeling that the governments were unable or unwilling to protect their population or to provide for them. And so you start to see a big surge in migration, and that reality hasn't really changed in recent years. And so when, in the case of Mexico, you start to see more and more migrant caravans, so a way of traveling of a couple hundreds of thousands of people traveling together, coming through the country, the López Obrador administration's first response was, let's give them all humanitarian visas, which would allow them to stay in Mexico and live and work for a set period of time. And sort of welcoming these caravans. And I think one was an underestimation of what that would mean in terms of generating demand. In the first 3 weeks that they issued all these visas for migrants coming through caravans in early 2019, over 18,000 humanitarian visas were issued. And so the government quickly put a stop to it because it was too successful. And so I think there was a sense of underestimating what having a more welcoming Mexico approach would mean to so many desperate people that were fleeing Central America. Some wanting to stay in Mexico. I know Alejandra can speak more of Mexico's own asylum system and the higher number of people seeking to stay in Mexico, but also just the high number of people wanting to reach the United States, in part because of economic realities, but a lot of people from Central America also have US-based family members. So a huge humanitarian or family unification pull, particularly for unaccompanied children who many times have parents or both parents already in the United States. And so starting in the spring of 2019, there was a huge pressure from the Trump administration on Mexico to do more to stem the flow of migrants coming. This is not the first time the US pressured Mexico on migration. If we go back to the Obama presidency, 2014, when you started to see the first wave of Central American families arriving at the border, what Obama at the time called the humanitarian crisis, he also pushed Mexico, encouraged Mexico to do more to stem the flow of migrants, which led to then President Peña Nieto's administration doing the Programa Frontera Sur, the Southern Border Program, which also increased enforcement. And so what changed now was not just please work with us, Mexico, but active threats by President Trump on Mexico, including the threat of economic tariffs on the Mexican economy. That, I think that threat in particular really is what pushed the Mexican government to act. And they both governments reached an agreement in June of 2019 that basically led to a significant uptick in immigration enforcement in both Mexico's southern and northern borders. Mexico deployed its newly created national security, the National Guard, its federal security force to both borders. I think over 10,000 National Guardsmen were positioned in southern Mexico, another 10,000 or more in northern Mexico to assist Mexico's immigration authorities in immigration enforcement. And it became very difficult to travel through Mexico, particularly in the southern border area. That has also led to a lot of difficulties for migrants themselves that I'm sure Maureen will touch on. So I will say the other aspect of this agreement, just in terms of time, was that the Mexican government also allowed for the expansion of a program called the so-called Migrant Protection Protocols, or what's known as Remain in Mexico, which basically the US unilaterally decided a program that asylum seekers seeking asylum in the United States are being sent back to Mexican border towns to wait for their immigration hearings. And that, I think, is one program that's clearly being legally challenged. There continues to be legal challenges to the program, but meant that what was once a pilot program in 2 or 3 Mexican border towns was expanded throughout the US, throughout the Mexico border, the US-Mexico border, into including states like Tamaulipas, which are considered some of the most dangerous parts of Mexico. And so this has been how immigration enforcement has been characterized lately with the López Obrador administration. I would say in 2019, we saw about a 34% increase in apprehensions of migrants as compared to 2018, over 182,000 people were apprehended. Enforcement has continued into 2020. Over 38,000 people have been apprehended by Mexican authorities in the first 6 months of this year. What is perhaps different from the López Obrador administration has been one, an expanded asylum system that I know Alejandra will talk about in terms of how more and more people view Mexico as a destination, but also how civil society, the UNHCR, and Mexico's Refugee Agency are working to look at capacity as being a country that is more of a destination country than just a transit country or a sending country. They are continuing with programs to seek to not hold asylum seekers in detention, immigration detention, which we would believe should be the last resort for anybody that's seeking protection in a country. Both the past commissioner, so Tonatiuh and then the current INM commissioner, Garduño, have purged, in a sense, the immigration agency of corrupt agents. There was an announcement last week of over 1,000 agents being removed from the immigration agency for allegations of corruption. This is, I think, important given the history of immigration agents being involved in abuses against migrants, extortion, or other crimes. It's not clear, however, though, how much that's a permanent basis on like internal affairs investigations and more of like an arbitrary decision. So there's a lot that still needs to be unpacked there. And I think on the US side, particularly in 2019, there was expanded Mexican support for consular affairs, given that the high number of Mexicans in the United States in need of legal assistance or otherwise. That unfortunately has been significantly cut this year, given austerity measures by the Mexican government. I think what we have seen, though, overall is that from the Peña Nieto administration to López Obrador, Mexico's approach has continuously been much more focused on detention and deportation, and then really looking at both protection concerns. So how do you ensure that migrants that may be seeking asylum are adequately informed of the possibility of seeking protection in Mexico or not, but also on protecting and guaranteeing their human rights and looking at migration from that rights respecting point of view. There had been promising programs the Mexican government had put forward to sort of subsidies, Jóvenes Construyendo Futuro and Sembrando Vida, which were meant to sort of provide employment opportunities for migrants, particularly in southern Mexico from Central America. These programs were also meant to be exported to Honduras and other countries in Central America. That has not happened. I think also because of budget limitations and what sounded like great promises that really haven't panned out on the ground, or where these programs also have a lot of restrictions that limit how many migrants can actually access their benefits, even in southern Mexico. And I think the last thing I want to touch on in terms of just the policy itself or concerns is that when the Mexican government allowed for this MPP program, the Remain in Mexico, to continue to be expanded in the northern border, very little was done to ensure adequate infrastructure for the thousands and thousands of people. Over 65,000 people have gone through the MPP program. It's estimated up to maybe 20 to 25,000 people are still waiting in Mexican border towns for their hearings in the United States, even in the light of the pandemic. And yet there was very little steps taken to, or not enough to address adequate shelter and housing for these individuals, access to healthcare, education, and I think particularly abuses against this population. How do you protect migrants, both that are waiting to get to the United States or that are in transit from the enormous number of crimes and human rights violations that are committed against them? So I think that's one of the big pending issues. This next week's actually the anniversary, the 10th anniversary of the massacre of the 72 migrants from in San Fernando, which La 72, the shelter Ramon Marquez was named after. And yet even in that case, the families of the victims are still looking for justice. And I think that is one of the big issues that still has not been addressed. Just quickly in the time here, what has changed? With the pandemic, I think there are fewer people coming through Mexico, in part because, particularly in Central America, governments closed their borders completely. So it's been very difficult to travel, both because of border closures, curfews that were in place or still in place in different countries, limits on public transportation. And so even if the conditions that are driving people to flee their homes still exist, the ability to do so has been certainly curtailed or limited. So I think there have been fewer people coming. Not to say none. Mexican authorities apprehended between April and June of this year about a little bit over 7,000 migrants. Small, it's less than actually just March as a month, but people are still trying to travel through Mexico. There are still people seeking asylum in Mexico that Alejandra can still speak to, but in general, the numbers are down, particularly as a result of the pandemic, but not because the situation has really changed on the ground. I think they're also decreased because the United States has adopted even more concerning measures to limit and close the US border down to anybody, including asylum seekers. So under what's called Title 42, under the guise of protecting public health, the US has basically eliminated the ability to seek asylum at the US-Mexico border. From what we know, only 2 people had actually been screened in this entire period for protection concerns. And for the most part, anyone apprehended, Mexicans, Central Americans in particular, are processed and returned to Mexico within 90 minutes. So very short turnaround, which has been very troubling in terms of adequate due process guarantees, but particularly people that might be seeking asylum, including unaccompanied children. And what this has meant for Mexico is that Mexico is not only receiving Mexican deportees, but also Central Americans. Mexico agreed to accept Central Americans that are being expelled from the United States in this procedure. What we know is that from March until July, over 104,000 people were expelled to Mexican border towns. So you have a huge pressure on these border areas and also on the Mexican authorities, who are now charged with returning these individuals to their countries of origin, even though it should have been the United States, and even though for the many cases people are actually seeking protection. So I think what we see at the border, the northern border of Mexico in particular, is very concerning in the result of COVID, because you have Mexican migrants that have been deported with COVID. There is the concern about others, deportees that may also spread it, but also just the conditions themselves. Matamoros is probably the most dire in terms of the encampment of asylum seekers under the MPP that are waiting to cross. It's between 1,000 to 1,500 people still there. The encampment's been flooded. There's more and more cases of COVID. And when you have people in these very close quarters, it's very easy for the virus to spread. And so a lot of concern about the population that's under the MPP. There are still thousands of people waiting to enter the United States to request asylum the right way, meaning at a port of entry. And that access has been closed since March as well. There are no hearings for the MPP until, who knows, at this point. They've been suspended indefinitely as a result of the pandemic. And we have over 88,000 Mexicans that have been deported to Mexican border towns or its interior this year alone. So it's a huge challenges for the Mexican authorities, but also for civil society, and how do you adequately support this population, particularly in light of a pandemic where it's, you know, how do you have the health conditions that you need for shelters, the equipment that you need, and then how do you guarantee that there's ability for these people to get the health services or social distancing setup that they might need. I think I will leave it at that so that we have more time later for sort of Q&A.
Great, thank you so much. I've already seen first questions coming. I think let's wait with answering those questions till after all of us present here. And thank you for unpacking this complexity of migration to Mexico. Perhaps now we can zoom on something even more specific in the on the issues concerning how are migrants applying for asylum in Mexico? What's the process like? What have been the trends? And what are the actually practical, perhaps hurdles and difficulties in obtaining protected status in Mexico, as well as what are the rights that are guaranteed formally by regulations, and perhaps where are the gaps in providing migrants with those rights? Alejandra, you direct Asylum Access Mexico office. Please tell us more about.
Thank you, Piotr, and thanks for the invitation to participate in this webinar. I have a PowerPoint presentation that I would like to share with all of you. I'm going to talk about the Mexican asylum system, then about the protection of refugees in Mexico in law and in the practice, the key trends in asylum seeking in Mexico, and the last point, it will be the impact of COVID-19 on asylum seekers and refugees. Well, I would like to mention that Asylum Access Mexico is part from Asylum Access Global, who is a non-profit and non-partisan civil society organization created in 2015. And in Asylum Access Mexico, we have been working since 2015, currently from our 7 offices across the country. Asylum Access Mexico helps refugees to have access to the rights through legal services and help them to find jobs and cultural opportunities. Well, in the Mexican asylum system, talking about the legal framework, I would like to mention that Mexico, Mexico is part from the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugee. And in the Mexican Constitution, in the Article 11 from 2011, we have the right to seek asylum. And also we are part from the Cartagena Declaration. I'm going to talk more about this, how the Declaration Cartagena is in the refugee law in Mexico. And in 2011 also Mexico published the law of refugees and the immigration law. Later in 2014, Mexico published the law for the protection of children. And this is important because in this law, there is a chapter who talk about the rights for children, migrant children, and says that migrant children must not be on the detention centers because they don't have a visa or documents who permits the permanent or temporal resident in Mexico. Who is a refugee in Mexico? Well, according to the refugee law in Mexico, a person could get the refugee status because they have some reasons from the 1951 Refugee Convention. This is someone who is outside of their country of origin and cannot return to that country due to a well-founded fear or persecution. And this persecution could be because race, religion, nationality, political opinion, membership in a particular social group. But also in the Mexican law, we have a gender. Also, a person could get the refugee status because they have a well-founded fear of gender. And also in the same refugee law, we have the definition of Cartagena Declaration. Someone who has fled their country because their life, safety, or freedom was threatened by general violence, foreign aggressions, internal conflict, or massive human rights violation. This is very important, these massive human rights violations, because from 2017, most of the people who are from Venezuela, they are getting the refugee status for this reason, because there is a massive human rights violation in Venezuela. And the Mexican asylum process, takes 45 working days. That says the laws, that when the person present a petition, they must wait for an answer in 45 working days. Now, this is not happening, and if we see what is happening after the contingents or the pandemic because COVID, they are not getting this decision in the 45 working days. They are waiting for this decision more than a year. When the person present the petition in the first 30 working days after their arrival in Mexico, they have to stay in the same state or city where they are doing this petition. They cannot move to another city. So this is very difficult for them who are in the southern border, because there are not a lot of opportunities for them. And even if they don't have documents, it's more difficult for them have access to the rights. I'm going to talk more about that in other slides. They have the right to get the humanitarian status card or humanitarian visa while they are asylum seekers, but this right is for some of them, is not for all of them. This is because the Immigration Institute doesn't have the same process in all the offices. It depends in which state the Immigration Institute wants to guarantee this visa. With this visa, the asylum seekers, they have the right to work, but if they don't have the visa, it's difficult for them to have access to work. And they have to go to the Immigration Institute or to Comar to sign every week. Now, because the pandemic for the coronavirus, this weekly signature has been suspended. But also, this is for them difficult to have access to other opportunities or to move to another cities, because if they don't have the permission from the Mexican authority, Comar, the Mexican Commission for Refugees, is difficult for them to continue with this process. And then they have to do an eligibility interview before Comar agent, and then they get the decision. If the decision is positive, they are going to get the refugee status with a permanent resident. And if they don't get, if they get a negative decision, they can appeal this decision. Then I'm going to talk about the protection on refugees in Mexico, what is in the law and what is in the practice. Well, I would like to say that when they are in the process to be recognized as refugee, it's very difficult for them to have documents. For example, in Mexico, to have access to education or to have access to health services, they must to have a CURP, that is an ID number. If they don't have this one, it's going to be very, very difficult for them to have this document. I would like to mention that Asylum Access has been complaining for more than, or complain with more than 200 cases, because there are more than 200 people without this document, and it's very difficult for them have this access to these rights. When they get the refugee status, they, as I mentioned before, they can get the permanent resident. They can apply for the Mexican nationality after 4 years, but if they are from a country from Latin America, after 2 years, they can get the Mexican nationality. Then they can bring the family to Mexico for, they can do the family reunification. And with the family reunification, the family, they can get also the refugee status, but they don't need to start a new process to get this refugee status. It's just if the family who get the refugee status before, they can get it as well. What are the barriers that we are facing in Mexico? Maureen was saying there is a detention and deportation. This has been increasing with the agreements between the Mexican government and the USA government. Another barrier is the language barriers. The 30-day application limit, because that means that most of the migrants or asylum seekers who arrive to Mexico by the southern border, they must to submit the application there. If they don't do that and they continue to try to arrive to the border with the USA, they are going to be late for these 30 days. But if they have a lawyer, they can have access for this application, because they can appeal this decision in case they don't have access for the application limit. There are travel restriction and integration. I'm going to talk more about this. The detention and deportation in migrants is a very common practice in Mexico. Despite international convention that is stating that it should be the last reason. In Mexico, the detention for asylum seekers and refugees or migrants is increasing in the last year. After 2019, with the agreements between Mexico and the USA, we see that they cannot cross the country. Most of them, they are being arrested in the southern border, and they don't have the information for have access to the asylum process. All the asylum seekers and refugees or migrants who are detained by the Immigration Institute, they are deported without the opportunity to claim asylum. This is very bad because the Immigration Institute doesn't have guidelines to identify who could be a refugee and if they will be in risk in case if they are deported to the origin country. The language barriers, many refugees in Mexico doesn't speak Spanish fluently. Some of them, they are from African or Asian countries. Others, they speak in the indigenous language and Haitian or Creole. And the Mexican laws requires that the asylum process be conducted in a language that the asylum seeker understands. But this right is not provided to all the asylum seekers and refugees. Before I was talking about the 30 days application limit, as I say, the asylum petition must be filed between the 30 working days of entering in the country. These applications should be applied in these, as mentioned before, in these cities in the south border. If they don't do this, due to the time limit, many refugees are forced to file the petitions. But as I mentioned before, if they have a legal representation, they can complain or appeal this decision, and later they can have access to this process. The travel restrictions and integrations, I would like to mention that many asylum seekers, they have to stay in this state where they apply. For example, Ramon can mention more about how is the situation in Tenosique or in other cities in the southern border where there are lack of opportunities for them. And in the practice, asylum seekers, they face social and economic obstacles to access to the basic rights like employment, education, health, and housing. And for example, for employment, I would like to mention that there is still a lot of ignorance by the employers that they don't know the rights for the refugees and they don't know the rights for migrants. For example, refugees, they have the right to work and most of them, they don't have a passport. So they are still asking for them to have a passport, for example, to have access to work. And if they want to open a bank account, it's also very difficult for them because they don't have these passports. And the banks, they are asking for a passport to open a bank account. So this is some of the obstacles that they are facing too. And there is also bureaucracy and processing of asylum petitions. The Comar doesn't have a lot of resources. They are lack of economic resources and people. The number of asylum petitions has been increasing in the last days. I'm going to show how the asylum petitions has been increasing from 2017 and in the last day in 2019. And Comar has few offices. For example, in the southern border, they has 4 offices, and in the northern border, they have only 2 offices. But in these offices, most of the agents from Comar, they are not, they don't have the authorization to sign documents. So this is very difficult for them to give the letters to the refugees that the letters or to have documents or the letters to start to the process and the Immigration Institute to get the humanitarian visa, for example. What is the impacts of the USA policies change? Well, the recent change in the USA policies have led to a substantial increase the number of asylum petitions, the militarization of Mexico's southern border, high levels of detention and deportation without access to the asylum system, and also a change in practice to no longer issue travel permits for refugees to travel to the USA border. Well, this is the numbers of asylum petitions that has increased in the recent years. If we see, for example, in 2017, there was more than 40,000 asylum petitions. In 2019, it was more than the double from 2018, 17,000, and in 2020 we have 22,000 petitions. But this 22,000 from petitions from 2020 is also because the pandemic and that we have for COVID. So most of the borders from Central America are closed, so are a lot of restrictions for migrants, asylum seekers or refugees to travel and to cross to Mexico. This is because we have few petitions this year. Well, the asylum seekers in 2020, 39% are women, 61% are men, and 19% they are children, 1% are unaccompanied children, and 80% are adults. And the nationality, 31% are from Honduras, and 16% from Haiti, 15% from Cuba, and the 9% from Guatemala. And the rest, the 21%, they have other nationalities. The impact from COVID with asylum seekers and refugees, the number of asylum seekers in Mexico has declined since April. This coincides with, as I mentioned before, the pandemic in the region and the closure of the borders. And between January and July of this year, 22,000 asylum petitions were filed, compared to 40,200 in the same period of 2019. Just to finish my presentation, I would like to mention that the current pandemic has led to the detention centers were emptied, but this is because the civil organization, they are doing a lot of strategic litigation. So there is the courts give an order to the Immigration Institute or the Mexican government to say that they have to end the detention for migrants and refugees because the pandemic, but we can say that this rise has not been guaranteed for many of them. The Immigration Institute, they abandoned all of them in the southern border. So this is very bad for them because they are not in the detention center, but they don't have access to other opportunities, like they are not getting health services, and also they don't have accommodation in a secure place, for example. And also many of the refugees who were working before now, they are not having they have been unjustified dismissals, for example, so it's difficult for them. And we have now many refugees, more than 80,000 refugees or asylum seekers who are waiting for a decision from the Mexican Commission of Refugee. So this means that because they don't have a document, it's difficult for them also to have access to other opportunities. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. By the way, I already received one question if your presentation will be available. So this is how interesting it was. Well, without taking more time, let's now focus on the situation in southern Mexico, eastern Mexico, in Tabasco. Ramon has had in-depth experience working with migrants directly. Tell us, perhaps tell us also what is La 72. We already mentioned it. I think it will be important to explain where the name comes from, because it leads us to a bigger question of the conditions that migrants face in Mexico. Please tell us, how does it look on the ground level? What are the conditions actually that drive migrants from Central America to Mexico, but also what are the conditions that they face upon arrival in Mexico, both in the south where you have worked and perhaps in other parts of the country, if the situation is different, let's say in Laredo or in Tijuana.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Thank you, Duke University, for organizing this webinar. First of all, La 72 is a migrant refugee shelter based in Tenosique, Tabasco. It's 30 miles away from the border with Guatemala. And it was founded in 2011. And the name comes in honor, in memory of the 72 migrants that they were assassinated, the massacre of San Fernando, Tamaulipas. That, as Maureen said, is going to be the anniversary next week, 23rd of August in 2010. So I was there 5 years as a director. So what I'm going to share with you is basically my experience from the field. Maureen and Alejandra, they just gave so many points, many ideas. I'm going to try to briefly go through different points before we go for the Q&A. Starting with, obviously the migration is a global phenomenon, and in this region, in this corridor, Central America, Mexico, and the US, we have been receiving in the last decade massive migration flows. Maureen was giving some numbers last year, according to the Mexican government, between January and June, we received 460,000 migrants and refugees entering Mexico, and according to the official numbers of the U.S. and the Mexican authorities, more than a million of migrants and refugees were detained by both authorities in the fiscal year of 2019. Basically, most of the people that we are receiving in the south border of Mexico, they are coming from Central America, from the Caribbean, as Alejandra showed, people from Cuba, from Haiti, people from South America. We need to keep in mind the people fleeing from Venezuela because of political reasons. And in a lower number, we are receiving migrants and refugees from Africa and from Asia. It's still a low number of people from Central America and from Caribbean and South America that they are fleeing to Europe. So basically they are heading to the north. So that makes this corridor to be probably one of the highest number of people moving, crossing, going through. Most of the people entering through the south border of Mexico, we need to emphasize that they enter with an irregular migratory status. And we are not only talking about migrants, as we have said before. It's like we need to keep in mind that many of them, they are refugees, they are asylum seekers, they are people that before were internally displaced, fleeing from conflict, from persecution, etc., etc. And just to point out some reasons why people are fleeing, we will need to talk about the corrupt and authoritarian governments. Second reason would be the neoliberal economic system that has been created extreme levels of poverty and inequality, the lack of access to really basic rights such as health, education, job opportunities, etc. The violence, of course. Some of the countries that I mentioned before had the highest rates of violence in the world in the last decade: Honduras, El Salvador, Venezuela, Guatemala. We cannot forget the natural disasters as well, that now and then they are happening and they are forcing the people to leave their home countries. So if we would talk about the last 10 years, we can definitely say that we are attending a new humanitarian crisis and a forced displacement mainly caused by violence. According to my experience in the south border of Mexico, more or less 1 of each 4 people that I attended or I met, they were fleeing from violence in Central America. What is makes like 25%, just to keep in mind. What's happening with the people when they are entering the south border of Mexico? First of all, they are facing a war of violence in Mexico. We can talk about massive and extreme violence and violation of human rights. For example, between 2015 and 2019, in those 5 years, at least 10% of the people that we received a la 72 suffered an episode of violence or violation of human rights, basically and mainly in Tabasco. That's the number of people that we identified. Probably is much more than 10%, but that's the number. That's what they told us in the verbal interview. The most common crimes are violent assaults, extortion, abuse of authority, kidnapping, people disappearing, sexual violence, and murder. The violence go through different peaks. There are certain months that the rate of violence is much higher. Could be that in a group of months we are attending more people kidnapped or more people that have suffered sexual violence. And then when we speak out, when we increase the pressure on the authorities, when we put massive police reports, we see how the violence is, or either it stops or is reduced. So that's kind of interesting when you are working on the field and you see how when you speak out, the level of violence goes down. And talking about the main actors committing the violence, we could talk about local criminal groups, organized crime, migration agents, police officers, and military. And what is the general response of the authorities? Is indifference, involvement, and collusion with the criminal groups. And we can clearly say that there is no access to justice. for the violence that the migrants and the refugees suffer in Mexico. Between 2015 and 2019, La 72 accompanied more than 900 police reports, and maybe not 99%, but I could say that 90% of the police reports, they ended with total impunity. The report that was mentioned before, that Walla wrote in last year in December 2018, The Wall Before the Wall, can give a better overview about the violence and the crimes in Mexico. But just to highlight three things that they are in the report, and I completely agree with them. It's like we need to put more pressure on the authorities to increase the investigation of the crimes. I mean, the prosecutors, officers should actually investigate crimes. We can say now that there are no investigation with the crimes. They need more financial and human resources in order to do the proper investigation. Sometimes we face like really basic or stupid problems, like saying like, I don't have petrol, I don't have money to go to the place, the scene of the crime, for example. So how I'm gonna do an investigation if I cannot go with the victim to the place that the crime happened? And the authorities must increase the collaboration with the organizations, with the shelters, with the human rights centers that they are working on the field, and they have so much information. I mean, from experience as director of La 72, I mean, we had identified the criminal groups, we have names, we have so much information that sometimes we did reports and we deliver to the prosecutors, officers, and nothing was happening. So impunity is the word that can just compilate all what I'm saying. We have been talking already about the access to rights in Mexico. I would like to highlight a few more things. First of all, the thing about the papers. When you receive the migrants, the refugees in a migrant shelter, the first word they say to you is like, quiero papeles. I want papers. How can I get papers? It doesn't matter. They don't understand about if it's a humanitarian visa, if it's like asylum seeker, a visa, it doesn't matter. They want papers. So here is a huge need of how are we gonna provide temporary visas for the migrants and the refugees crossing to Mexico. How we are gonna provide the protection, because at the end, having visas means protection and means access to basic rights like Alejandra was pointing, work. If I don't have a permanent visa, I cannot get the access to work. And the employees are not gonna hire me. So papers is one of the main obstacles that we find defending rights in Mexico. We have talked already about the massive detention and deportation. That's another problem that we are facing in the south border of Mexico. Certain years, 95% of the people that they were detained, they were immediately deported to Central America. So there is no access to rights and to any kind of protocol protection. The access to the public health, that's another big issue. And now with the COVID pandemic is an example. How are we going to face the public health for the local people, but for the people on the move crossing to Mexico? Here we have a good example of collaboration that we have done with, and it's Doctors Without Borders have been pushing a lot since 2013, 2012, I don't remember well, when they started operation working with the trans migrant. And they have done a great job guaranteeing and pushing for the access for the public health. The access to education, that it has been blocked for many years. Alejandra was mentioning about the curve, that ID that you need to access to different documents, different rights. So the education hasn't been guaranteed in Mexico for the minors that they want to continue with their studies. And the integration programs. We could clearly say that there are not public policies attending not only the humanitarian aid, but the integration. And the small programs that we have, they are all focused in refugees, in people that have been granted asylum. The other migrants and asylum seekers, they don't have basically access to the integration. Only some UN agencies, they have programs that they are giving support, like economical support, access to some kind of training, work, education, and it has been an advance in the recent years. And talking about rights, I would highlight one more thing, and is we need to raise the community awareness, especially focused in communities that they are on the transit or receiving the people. We have been from 2015 until now how the discrimination has increased, and the phenomenon of the caravans hasn't helped this thing. So it's an urgent matter that we need to attend. One more interesting point I want to share with you is like how it has been the response to this humanitarian crisis. Maureen was talking about the change of the migration situation policy, the reinforcement of the border during the Obama administration, during the Trump administration. So we can clearly say that between 2015 and 2020, the spaces receiving migrants and refugees in the south border of Mexico, they have had to change, and they are attending a new reality. We need to quick response to this reinforcement of the borders, and suddenly the migrant shelters in the south, they were not attending migrants on the move anymore, or exclusively. They were attending asylum seekers, refugees that they were not staying for 1 or 2 days. They were staying for weeks or even for months. So there were new realities and issues of the mobility in the region that we need to face straight away. First, the humanitarian crisis response. How we are going to provide food, shelter, preparation of new spaces. They were not only men, they were families, they were LGBT people, they were unaccompanied minors, they were the increase of the women in the migration was huge in the last 4 or 5 years. Second, how we are going to attend the human rights violations, and how are we going to prove the human rights attention. Not only attend the victims of crime, but the migrant shelters had to start attending the asylum seekers, something that it was completely new from 2014 to 2015. For example, Untitled in 2014 had like 200 asylum seekers, applicants, and last year I think it was more than 1,200. So Alejandra was sharing the increase of the number in general in Mexico, so that's a new reality regarding the human rights. Third, how are we going to accompany the most vulnerable groups? And four, like how are we going to raise the voice? How are we going to speak out through reports, through different documents, in order to make public the violation of the human rights, the crisis that the migrant shelters were attending in the south border of Mexico. In this period of 5 years, it was really, really important, the network, the joint response. We saw how many organizations were coming to work in the south border of Mexico, the Jesuit Refugee Service, the International Committee of the Red Cross, Doctors Without Borders, Asylum Access, the UNHCR, the IOM, UNICEF, and many other organizations. So we had to create a joint response and work together in order to respond to this humanitarian crisis. And I would like to end this part saying that I see many similarities with the current crisis in the cross-border region in Mexico and in the US. What it has been happening 2019, 2020 between the cross-border Mexico and US is what we have been facing in the south border of Mexico since 2014, 2015. How are we doing with time?
Well, we should probably be moving towards questions and answers. But if there is any last statement you would like to make, please do it.
Well, just basically, just to point a couple of things of the effects of the COVID, of the pandemic in the south border of Mexico. we are attending a new crisis, and it's a health crisis. We never had to face it before.
Yeah.
So how are we going to deal with it? I mean, we are migrant shelter, so we are a human rights center. So it's something we need to learn how are we going to approach it. One important point, the migration flow completely stopped between March and April. For example, La 72 received in April 2020, 44 people. In comparison with the same month in 2019, it was 2,066 people. 44 before now, and 2,066 last year. We have never seen that before. Nothing had stopped the migration flow, anything before like that. We have to work first with prevention, access to information. We need to get prepared about how are we going to deal with this pandemic. Preparation of spaces, adequacy of spaces, separate spaces for people that they were transited, that they were on the move, people that they were applying for asylum, they were permanently staying in the shelters, and people that they could be possible positive COVID. So we have to do magic to adequate the spaces in the shelters. And one important consequence I would finish with is like many of the migrant shelters or many of the spaces are not receiving new arrivals anymore. So they are just waiting to see what's going to happen with the crisis and how are they going to deal with this. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Well, let's move to the questions. You just opened so many possible venues that we can discuss right now. One of the questions that maybe you can just clarify, all of you, is how come Mexico is witnessing the growth of animosity towards migrants? Mexico itself is an immigration country. How come we can see violence in Mexico and maybe lukewarm, if not cold, sometimes reception of migrants? That was one of the questions. So. Whoever would like to answer this.
I think the colleagues in Mexico probably have more to say. I would just count one thing, which is Mexico as a country has less than 1% of the population as foreign born. So as a country that does not have a long history of receiving mass numbers of people, or who was traditionally coming in or more welcome were political refugees from the Southern Cone or from Spain. And so this is a new type of migrant or individual coming into Mexico, particularly from Central America. I would say, and I'm sure they would see what others say as well, that the challenge with the shelter experience a lot of times is that where migrants are, you have criminal groups that are seeking to prey on them. And so that, in a sense, also attracts criminality to areas that you didn't always see that. And so I think there's been at times more backlash against migrants and attempt to criminalize migrants, not because of the criminals themselves, but because they are victims of criminal groups that are preying, looking for them, and that sort of attracts that these individuals to areas where migrants are. And so I think it's that. And to highlight, Mexican population was very welcoming of the first few caravans that came through. And I think it was a representation, a reflection of recognition of Mexico as a country of immigrants themselves. There's so many people that have, left Mexico. But there was also, I think, that the limit to that, looking at how many, the waves of caravans maybe became too much for communities that are also oftentimes struggling themselves to survive. If you're looking at the, Chiapas, for example, as a state that, both Chiapas and Tabasco, some of the most marginalized states in Mexico, the poorest population. And so I think that was also another challenge, but I'd be curious to see what others would have to say.
That's right.
Well, I would add something, like I was highlighting before, like how the importance of raising the community awareness about the crisis that we have been facing. I mean, this has been happening for many years. It's nothing new. And it's coming up and down. But we don't see any movement, any worrying, any programs from the government in order to face this. Like that's a need. And when we have been doing advocacy with the federal, with the state, with the local government, we have always been pointing that, careful with that. That's an issue. And we have seen like how, for example, in Tabasco, some communities that were welcoming very well the migrants and the refugees, how they are more suspicious about it, and how some levels of violence have been related with this. So there is a lot of things to do, and we need to work to the authorities and civil society organizations.
Maybe I just move forward with, there are more questions, unless Alejandra would like to say something, or?
Well, I would like to add that also the promises from the federal government is that they are going to give more opportunities to the migrants, and well, the Mexican community is not very happy with that, because also they are asking for that opportunities for them. So this is the message that the governments are giving, instead to work together for migrants and refugees, to involve them in the same programs. They are creating discrimination against this population.
Thank you. We'll move forward with more questions. Laura Villa has asked several questions. I think some of them have been already answered in Alejandra's presentation. And just for the attendees, we will make the video and the slides available to the attendees. So certainly some of the points Alejandra covered will be in the slides. There are a couple of questions from Laura that I would like to ask the panelists. One is Mexico receiving international aid to better serve the asylum seekers? And the second one, what is the rate of acceptance of a case as refugee who is being denied the refugee status? I mean, this is a big topic, but if you can just provide some, highlight something about this. Maybe Alejandra? Or...
Yes, well, from the legal humanity, well, I would like, from the legal aid, UNHCR is here in Mexico, and they are supporting a lot, for example, to the Mexican Commission for Refugees, to increase the presence for them in some parts of the country. And also they are helping with humanitarian assistance and providing help to the shelters, and the shelters are also, they are providing humanitarian assistance to migrants and refugees.
And what is the rate of acceptance of a case as refugee, if you know it?
Well, I'm not sure, but I think most of the 17% now they are getting the refugee status. Also, we have in Mexico another, they can, if they don't get the refugee status, they can get the complementary protection. Is similar to the refugee status, but that means that if they don't have the refugee status, but they cannot go back to the origin country, they have the complementary protection.
Okay, thank you.
Can I add on the international assistance? I mean, I think it's a good question, because at one part, as Alejandra said, the UNHCR is probably the biggest actor in terms of supporting civil society. A lot of that fund, oddly enough, does come from the United States. I think there's been a lot of bipartisan support in Congress to continue to fund internationally support for refugees and asylum seekers. Unfortunately, that has not necessarily translated into the U.S. abiding by its own international commitments, but I think it is an important area that the U.S. has, provided some support for, a lot of support for UNHCR, as well as through other accounts. But one thing that the flag is that Comar's budget is like $2 million for the year. I can't remember the exact amount. I mean, if there was a true commitment by the Mexican government to really adopt its role as an asylum, like a destination country, we need to see a lot more money from the Mexican government to fund its own asylum system, and that really hasn't happened yet. And what Alejandra pointed to is some of the difficulty that even if UNHCR is supporting a lot of staff for Comar, but the Mexican government has to pay the staff, if I remember correctly, to do the asylum officers themselves. So there's only so much that international support can do without the Mexican government also committing more funds to it. And I think it's clear that the head of Comar has an idea of what he needs, and Andres Ramirez, the head of Comar, what he needs, what kind of funding, but that hasn't necessarily translated into a commitment higher up to ensure that Comar, and certainly going into next year, has a bigger budget to do the job that it needs to do and to do it well.
Okay, maybe following on the applications, Robert just asked a question about the fraudulent applications for asylum. Has this been the case in Mexico, that in one way or another maybe affects public mood against migrants, or not at all? That's Robert's question. Anybody? Alejandra, maybe you have.
Yeah, I would like to say that yeah, it's increasing the discrimination against the population, and we have some surveys, for example, from years ago, where the Mexican community, if you ask to them why they think about migrants to come to Mexico, and they say they are welcome. But after this, with this new government that we have here in Mexico, they changed their minds. They are not, most of them, they are not welcome, all the migrants and refugees. But I think this is because there is, as Maureen says before, for example, Chiapas and Tabasco, there is a lot of poverty, and there is a lack of opportunities for most of them.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Giovanni?
Sorry, from Romina, there is a question about, she's very interesting to know about women migration and gender issues in Mexico. How does the stabilized security situation in Mexico affect the migration and the US itself? So some focus on women migration and gender issues. Maureen or Ramon, just.
I mean, I can talk. I would say in general, women are, in terms of women in migration, are the most vulnerable, and I think both Ramon and Alejandra in their cases could speak to that in terms of women migrants that are subject to sexual abuse and others, and how many women take contraceptives preventatively because looking at what may face them on the journey. Mm-hmm. One challenge, if you look at the U.S., and I think that's part of the question, is with the U.S. system right now and opinions by the Attorney General that seek to limit the eligibility of women or people that have been victims of gender violence, it certainly closes the door, unfortunately, makes it harder for asylum seekers in the United States to gain access to asylum based on gender-based persecution. It is something that is also, excuse me, being challenged or worked around, but I think that is a limitation that would not be the case in Mexico in terms of asylum claims. But I think in general, I would say, and I'm sure others would, that women are probably the most vulnerable part of that population, just in terms of the types of abuses that they can be subject to in the journey.
Mm-hmm. Perhaps the last question, because we are unfortunately approaching the end. What happens to those who miss the 30-day application deadline, and in reality, when migrants are not given protection? Are they told to leave? Are they deported? If so, how does it work in practice? Are they what happens in practice to those who don't obtain protected status?
Yeah, for those who doesn't have access to the asylum process within the 30 days, they have the opportunity to appeal this decision, and they can, well, they are two ways to appeal. This is they can appeal under administrative court, and also they can appeal for another, it's called amparo, like kind of habeas corpus. There is two ways to appeal this decision, but also we are doing a strategic litigation in asylum access to eliminate these 30 days from the law, because within that asylum, to seek asylum is a right, so should not be a date or like this 30 days. So we are doing this strategic litigation but for that one who doesn't have the opportunity, I would like to mention that some of them, they get bad information or they get wrong information about the best for them is to go out from the country and come back again in the country and start again for or start the application between the 30 days. But for that ones who doesn't have, this is the process to appeal the decision from Comar.
Giovanni.
Yes, so this is really the last question. It's from Miguel Sotero. It's about climate migration. And according to modeling from ProPublica and New York Times, in the most extreme climate scenarios, more than 30 million migrants would head toward the US border over the course of the next 30 years. So from 700,000 to 1.5 million a year in the next 10 years. Any comment on that? Or is something that you are working on in terms of your, or have you been discussing your organizations about the impact of climate migration?
I'll take that. Yeah, we have been receiving now and then migrants. Maybe they are not, they don't understand that they're migrating because of the climate change, but they're coming with a speech of there was a situation with the land, my growing is not working. So it's not only the climate change thing. It's about the COVID as well. It's something that we have been talking about that we haven't put enough attention yet, and it's the next one that is coming. I mean, we see this year in the region how the tropical storm, the hurricanes, has been the highest number in the history, and we are only in August. That's an example. So what's going to happen if we have a huge hurricane, earthquake, a plague, or so? I hope it makes sense. I don't know if I'm expressing myself well, but yeah, that's the one that we need to get ready for. And it hasn't been yet there, but we have seen some signs.
Thank you.
And I would just say, just from an organization that looks at U.S. foreign policy and what's happening with cooperation, this is something that we're working to figure out. How do you incorporate more into cooperation, and how we talk about regional flows of people is looking at climate change produced migration and flows and the impact that is having on the region. So it is something that we are also aware of. Oxfam has done a lot of work with us and others on like, how do you introduce this into the bigger discussions here in terms of what foreign aid should look like. So I think it's a key issue. That piece is really interesting too and has some good graphics, so people should certainly check it out. It is something that I think we should all be aware of. But as Ramon said, this is a bigger issue between climate change and then we have what is the post-COVID dynamic going to look like, just given the huge economic impact the pandemic is having in this region in particular, and inequality, and in the amount of people that would likely leave their home countries. And so I think this requires a much more regional response from the US, Canada, the US, but also, you know, what Mexico's role is as both a transit country, but more and more of a destination country. So there's a lot of things that need to be addressed more regionally than they are currently.
Piotr, I think
I would like to then close thanking all the guests for sharing their expertise. For better or worse, Mexico's geographical location will mean that there will be more migration to Mexico, and perhaps the only good news about it is that your knowledge will be in higher and higher demand in the next year. So thank you so much for allowing me to introduce you to the public. It was a pleasure to speak to you now and speak to you before. You have a tremendous amount of knowledge, and thank you so much.
And thank you very much from the Duke Center for Literature Development and the Duke Center for Literature and Global Studies. Thank you for the time. And certainly there are so many issues that you touch upon that will be worth exploring in the future. So like climate change and post-COVID-19 migration. So I'm sure we will reach out to you again. And whatever you would like to share in terms of information about your organizations, publication, etc., we will make sure to publish publicize whatever you're doing. And certainly the job you're doing, it's not only important, but I would say crucial. And thank you very much for doing that. And thank you to Piotr, thank you to Amanda Frederick, Jason Doty, Roini, and Gianluca Corinaldesi, Tiffany, and Götzinger, and Sarah Bermeo at DCID. Thank you, and hopefully stay tuned, and we will send the recording articles and slides to the attendees. And thank you to the attendees for their patience.